Welcome to Blackman Folktales. Kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also like and share. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell, as this means the whole world to us. The grand estate of Isabella Hartmann stood like a fortress at the edge of the city, its tall iron gates and sweeping marble staircase a symbol of power and perfection. From the outside, neighbors whispered with admiration about the woman who had built such a life of elegance after tragedy. Few knew the storm that raged behind those walls, for beneath the chandeliers and velvet curtains lay a house ruled by fear, silence, and cruelty. Isabella, a woman of striking beauty and commanding presence, had long ago traded tenderness for coldness. Betrayal from her husband years ago had turned her heart to stone, and rather than deal with the pain, she buried it beneath layers of pride. She wore her wealth like armor, using it to command those around her with an iron fist. To her guests, she was the flawless hostess with a smile that dazzled. To her staff, she was a tyrant whose every glance was a judgment and every word, a dagger. The one who bore the weight of that cruelty most was Clara, a fragile young maid who had been hired months earlier. Barely in her 20s, Clara moved through the estate like a shadow, silent and unseen unless Isabella chose to unleash her wrath upon her. A broken plate, a speck of dust missed on the shelves, or even the sound of her footsteps echoing at the wrong time was enough to draw Isabella's scorn. "Clumsy girl," she would bark. "Can't you do anything right?" The words stung more than any physical strike, for they reopened wounds Clara carried from long before she arrived at the mansion. Clara's past was nothing like the marble halls she now walked. She had once belonged to a humble but warm family, her childhood filled with laughter, stories by candlelight, and the scent of her mother's cooking drifting from their small kitchen. But those memories were stolen in one cruel night when fire tore through their home. Clara had woken to choking smoke, her parents' frantic cries, and then, silence. By dawn, the house was nothing but ash, and Clara stood in the cold with no one left to call family. Orphaned and penniless, she was taken into the care of strangers, passed from one distant relative to another until even they could no longer carry her burden. When she finally arrived at Isabella's estate, she thought, for a fleeting moment, that fate had granted her a place of stability. But it wasn't long before she realized that her new home was a cage gilded in gold. The woman who owned it carried her own invisible scars and unleashed them on Clara daily. Yet Clara, unlike Isabella, refused to let pain turn her bitter. She endured the harsh words, bowing her head, retreating into silence, and praying that her suffering was not without purpose. Though she was often left in tears, she would rise each morning, whispering to herself, "I survived worse. I will survive this too." What Isabella never knew was that inside Clara's fragile frame lived a resilience carved by tragedy, a strength she herself lacked despite her wealth. But Isabella's cruelty was not born of mere habit. It was her shield against a life that had disappointed her at every turn. Years ago, when she had stood at the altar and said her vows, she believed she was stepping into a fairy tale. Her husband, Richard, was charming, successful, and promised her the world. For a time he gave it. They traveled to Paris, strolled along beaches in Spain, and danced under crystal chandeliers in halls filled with music. But behind the glamour, cracks were forming. Richard's eyes began to wander, his late nights grew frequent, and his words, once sweet, became sharp. When his betrayal was finally exposed, it broke Isabella in ways she could not repair. Rather than confront the pain, she redirected it. She buried herself in building her empire, buying houses, hosting galas, and surrounding herself with luxury. Yet the emptiness never left. Every smile she forced for society was a mask to hide the bitterness gnawing at her. Clara, in all her innocence, became the perfect vessel for that bitterness. She reminded Isabella of everything she once was, gentle, hopeful, and unbroken, and that reflection was intolerable. Each harsh command and insult was less about Clara's mistakes and more about Isabella's own torment. But fate has a strange way of weaving lives together. The very girl Isabella belittled daily would one day stand as the mirror that forced her to confront her own brokenness, and the hands she pushed away would become the same hands that would drag her from the flames of her own undoing. For now, however, Isabella remained blind to the truth, and Clara endured her cruelty in silence, unaware that destiny was already crafting a story neither of them could have imagined. The night it happened was like any other, at least that was how it began. The rain had been falling heavily since late afternoon, drumming against the tall windows of the Hartmann mansion. The staff moved hurriedly, preparing Isabella's dinner, fluffing pillows, and ensuring every corner sparkled in case she decided to find fault. Clara, exhausted from a long day of endless commands, tiptoed through the corridors with a tray of tea. She had grown accustomed to the rhythm of Isabella's cruelty, anticipating her moods and learning when silence was safer than speech. That night, however, a strange tension filled the air. A flicker of the lights hinted at something wrong, and soon the low scent of smoke drifted faintly into the halls. At first, Clara thought it was her imagination, but then the alarms blared. Panic erupted among the servants. Doors slammed, voices shouted, and feet pounded down the stairs as fire crackled somewhere deep in the house. The mansion, filled with fine curtains and polished wood, became a trap of fuel waiting to ignite. The other maids fled, abandoning their posts, but Clara froze, her heart hammering. She remembered too vividly the fire that had claimed her family, the suffocating smoke, the way flames danced mercilessly until there was nothing left. Fear clawed at her chest, begging her to run, but another thought struck her harder. Isabella is still inside. The woman who had insulted her, belittled her, and crushed her spirit countless times now lay vulnerable within those burning walls. Clara stood trembling in the foyer as smoke thickened, listening as staff scrambled to escape through the servants' exit. "Don't go back," one of them cried when they saw her glance upstairs. "It's not worth it." But Clara couldn't move toward the door. Something deep inside her, stronger than bitterness, stronger even than fear, urged her upward. She sprinted toward Isabella's quarters, coughing as smoke clawed at her lungs. The heat was unbearable, flames licking at the edges of curtains and swallowing furniture whole. Clara pressed her sleeve over her mouth and pushed through, her legs weak but determined. She reached Isabella's room only to find the door locked, as it often was when Isabella wanted no interruptions. Clara banged her fists against it, shouting, "Madam, wake up. The house is on fire." Silence answered her. The smoke grew thicker and panic rose in Clara's throat. With a desperate cry, she threw her body against the door once, twice, until it splintered open. Inside, Isabella lay collapsed on the floor, her silk gown stained with soot, her face pale from the smoke. For a heartbeat, Clara froze, staring at the woman who had made her life a misery. She could have turned away, left her to fate. But Clara's heart would not allow it. She rushed forward, pulling Isabella's limp form into her arms, whispering, "Please, please hold on." The journey out was a blur of fire and chaos. Clara's small frame struggled under Isabella's weight, but she dragged her mistress inch by inch through the hall, her lungs screaming for air. Flames roared on either side, beams groaned overhead, and part of the ceiling crashed down behind them as if urging them forward. Clara prayed with every step, tears cutting lines through the soot on her cheeks. At last, she staggered out into the rain, collapsing onto the wet grass with Isabella cradled against her. The mansion burned behind them, flames tearing through the home that had once stood as a symbol of Isabella's pride. Sirens wailed in the distance as neighbors shouted, rushing toward the scene. Clara coughed violently, her chest burning, but when she looked down at Isabella's unconscious face, she felt only relief. She had done it. She had saved the very woman who had made her life miserable. Paramedics arrived, lifting Isabella onto a stretcher, and as they rushed her into the ambulance, Clara followed, refusing to leave her side. She had no idea that this act of selflessness would be the beginning of a transformation neither of them could have foreseen. When Isabella opened her eyes days later in the hospital, she was greeted not by polished walls or servants waiting on her but by the fragile figure of Clara sitting by her bedside. The girl's clothes were wrinkled, her face still marked by soot, but her eyes held a quiet determination. Isabella blinked, disoriented, and then memories of the fire rushed back, the choking smoke, the flames, the darkness. She realized with dawning horror that she would have died if not for the girl she had despised. Her voice was hoarse when she finally spoke, barely a whisper. Why would you save me?" Clara looked at her, and though exhaustion shadowed her features, her words were steady. "Because pain should never be repaid with pain. You needed help and I couldn't turn away." Those simple words pierced deeper than any accusation. Isabella felt shame wash over her, shame heavier than the smoke that had nearly suffocated her. She remembered every insult she had thrown at this girl, every cruel command, every moment she had used her power to wound rather than to heal. For the first time in years, Isabella's pride cracked and tears slipped down her cheeks. She reached for Clara's hand, her voice breaking. "I don't deserve your kindness. I don't deserve forgiveness." But Clara, who had known pain far greater than cruel words, squeezed her hand gently and whispered, "No one does. That's what makes it forgiveness." From that moment, Isabella was never the same. Recovery was slow, but her transformation began long before her body healed. She could no longer look at Clara without seeing the depth of her own failures. She began to apologize, awkwardly at first, then with tears and sincerity. She asked Clara to tell her about her life, about the fire that had taken her family, and for the first time, Isabella listened without judgment or interruption. She realized that the girl she had dismissed as weak was in fact stronger than she could ever claim to be. Slowly, a bond began to form between them, one rooted not in hierarchy but in respect. Isabella hired tutors for Clara, encouraging her to pursue the education she had long been denied. More than that, she began to open her heart, shedding the bitterness that had defined her for so long. Each act of kindness toward Clara was also an act of healing toward herself, mending the broken parts of her soul that had been shattered years ago by betrayal. The mansion was gone, reduced to ashes, but Isabella no longer cared. She understood now that walls and wealth could not protect her from emptiness. What mattered was the chance to love and be loved again, even if that love came from the most unexpected place. In time, Isabella and Clara's story became one that inspired many. When Isabella rebuilt, It wasn't another mansion for herself but a shelter for young women who had been orphaned or abandoned, just like Clara. She poured her resources into education programs, mentorships and housing, determined to give others the chances she had once denied her maid. Clara became her partner in this mission, her voice of compassion guiding Isabella's newfound purpose. Together they stood before crowds at charity events, not as mistress and servant but as equals bound by a bond forged in fire. Isabella often introduced Clara as, "the girl who saved my life," and Clara would gently add, "and the woman who found hers." Their journey was a living testimony that redemption is never too far gone, that kindness can break the hardest of hearts, and that sometimes the people we mistreat are the very ones destined to lift us up. Isabella had once been the woman who ruled her house with cruelty, but now she was remembered as the woman who turned her ashes into hope, all because a maid she once despised chose love over revenge. Thank you for watching. Kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos as this means a lot to us.